Thanks so much, Don, and thanks everyone for joining me here on the State of OpenCon. And today I'd like to talk to you about these cases when your open source turns to the dark side. It's a bit funny, by the way, that the screen is there and I'm here, so I'll just wave my hands, and when there's something interesting, I'll point you there, but most importantly is just to talk about this topic. And let's start with, we all got this just in the spring, right? Redis moved away from open source and into a source available SSPL license. Just out of curiosity, who got paged or alerted on this one? It's part of the spring break. Okay, less than I expected, but the reason is that it's a very, very fundamental component in many projects and many communities, talking about Ruby on Rails and Python, Django, so many use that, so it's definitely impactful. And that wasn't the only surprise. 2024 had quite a few other surprises for open source. I gave a few examples here on the screen, but let's not go over them. But check out the QR code, by the way, that's there. I wrote a summary of 2024, turbulent year for open source, but also the community. I called it the community strikes back, and the successes of the forks, some of which we heard this morning from Don and others. So, as I say, as you can see on my T-shirt, may the open source be with you, with us all. And yeah, we all have open source, but we need to face the fact that sometimes open source turns to the dark side. And actually, there are many ways in which open source can turn to the dark side. So one is obviously going non-open source, the relicensing. We talked about Redis, we talked about Terraform, and others. You heard a lot about it, and you'll hear more. But we need to remember that's not the only thing. For example, a project can actually go copyleft, like moving from Apache 2.0 to AGPL version 3, for example. And while AGPL is a perfectly valid OSI-approved license, it might not be what you intended when you chose this library or dependency. And for example, at the CNCF, I'm a CNCF ambassador, by the way, so we use Apache 2 as the practice, and just imagine one of the dependencies of one of the projects suddenly switching from Apache to AGPL. And we need to issue a whole page to instruct the project what to do to make sure that they don't automatically upgrade these dependencies. But we need to remember, open source is more than a license. So an open source project can also change the terms of service. For example, we've seen that with Terraform registry, a significant component of that open source ecosystem. Or it can change the release policy, like we've seen just last year with Linkerd, that last year stopped releasing binaries of stable releases. Or CentOS, that just last year reached the end of life for version 7 and essentially switching over to CentOS Stream as the unstable, I guess, open source of RHEL. Or simply just shifting engineering resources from the open source to commercial offering, as we've seen just in the past couple of months with Puppet, I gave the example before, or with WordPress. Okay, so again, many ways that open source can turn to the dark side, as I said. And all these cases, if we look down into it, it boils down to a single vendor that owns this project and makes these changes based on its business needs, competitive landscape, pressure, and so on. Which, of course, begs the question, is vendor-owned open source an oxymoron? Now, I've been asking this question for a good few years. Some of you may have run into my the blog that I wrote about it back then. And the thing is that today, we're in 2025, this question is more relevant than ever. And for us as a community to really understand that, and what better place than the future of open source here in this track. So glad to have this stage. So what can we learn from these cases to our day-to-day as individuals? And in the short time that I have, I want to share some learnings for building open source, for using open source, for vetting new open source to your project, even for redistributing, repackaging open source. So let's go straight into it. And let's start with building open source. And if you're building open source, remember, open source is not a business model. I cannot stress that enough. We heard that also this morning from Amanda. Remember that if there's one thing that you take out of that as builders, remember that. And by the way, whether you're a startup or a multinational or a single maintainer with your passion project, remember, open source is not a business model. So if you're a vendor and you choose the open source path, you should build a sustainable business model. And those who don't end up in this conflict between the community needs and the business ones, and then end up relicensing defensively or doing all these other things, creative things that we've seen before. And if you're a single maintainer, and if you decide to open source your project, please don't expect material compensation out of this project, okay? Even if all the Fortune 500s use your library or your dependency, don't expect that. And you know, there are plenty of ways to earn a good, decent living from developing software, also from even open source development. But taking your project and open sourcing it, that's not it. Or of course, go down the vendor path. You can establish a vendor around your open source, like I don't know, Confluent for Kafka or something like that. And then it's a different game. And then go back to my advice for the vendors. So that's on building open source. Now let's talk about using open source and how to do it safely. So the first thing is manage your third-party licensing exposure. Just like you manage your third-party security exposure, okay? Prefer the least restrictive license, of course, and also look for license contamination, like Apache 2 containing GPL or things like that. And in this context, maintaining SBOM, software bill of materials, is going to make your lives much, much easier. So very, very good practice. We heard about this also this morning on the panel. Remember that. Second, take care with automation. Okay, run license compliance checks before updating third-party dependencies. Don't auto-update without safeguards, guardrails in your CI/CD pipeline. Just imagine those who automatically updated their Redis from 7.2 to 7.4. You know, minor release. What's the big deal? And 7.4 is a different license. So be aware of that. And lastly, code smells can signal upcoming changes, and it can buy you time to respond proactively rather than reactively. So things such as mixed code licenses within the database, within the same data set, code set. It could be telemetry collection, dial home features, things like that that don't add up with the open source. I usually give the test, like a just forky test. If you feel that you can hit the fork button and end up with a valid, independent project, no strings attached to the original, that's a good signal. If you think that you'll then need to start pulling specific lines of code and deleting things that are proprietary and things like that, that's not a good, healthy signal. Of course, it requires familiarity with the source code, but many of us go into the source code anyway to understand. This is part of the advantages of open source, right? So keep your noses open. If you're distributing, repackaging open source, then remember, open source is only about the source, okay? The source code. Open source doesn't mean open trademark. We also happen with WordPress, still ongoing. It doesn't mean that you can just take the brand name, the logo, things like that. It also doesn't mean open documentation. Okay? You repackage, it doesn't mean that just take the documentation. Also doesn't mean open build. Someone invested in building the release pipeline, CI/CD, automation, all of that. You may very well need to rebuild it from scratch for your repackaged version. Okay? Remember that. Lastly, if you're vetting a new open source tool library for your organization, some considerations, obviously on top of the regular tool selection criteria. So first of all, obviously, what's the license? And remember, not all open source licenses are born equal. We talked about this. If you have two tools that are on equal grounds, obviously prefer the least restrictive license. And remember, please remember, source available is not open source. I know that amongst this crowd it's much clearer, but you'd be surprised how many out there are still confused, and for good reasons, all sorts of marketing campaigns that try to blur the line. So please pass on open source. Source available is not open source. And also ask who's behind the open source, okay? If it's a one-man show, a single maintainer, so which is the largest majority of projects out there, it's a single point of failure. If it's a single vendor, we saw what could happen, may change. So look for diversity. We saw the nice stats by Don this morning that showed that foundational open source is a good signal for diversity. It's not owned by a vendor, it's owned by the foundation. It provides vendor neutral ground. So for good reasons, it fosters diversity. And also, check what the governance policy is, okay? How they ensure no single vendor grabs control, what's the promotional path to contributor, to maintainer, who can review and approve PRs, who can ultimately decide on relicensing if such a thing comes up. So let's sum up. Open source is more than a license, as we've seen, and open source can turn to the dark side in many forms. It can be relicensed, but also we saw change of terms of service, of release policies and others. And it can happen to veteran projects as well, a decade old or older. It can happen any time. You can find more examples in this QR code in this article. So make sure to select open source wisely. We talked about which license, who's behind the project, what's the governance. Make sure to use open source wisely. We talked about managing licensing exposure, not to auto-update without safeguards, code smells, and so on. Make sure to build open source wisely. No, open source isn't a business model, remember that. And if you redistribute, remember that open source is about the source code, not the other pieces. And always ask yourselves, who is the hour in source? Okay? So, I'm Dotan Horovits. If you have anything interesting out of this talk, feel free to reach out to me at Horovits. You see everywhere. I'm at Horovits. By the way, this is from just exactly a year ago when I was this time after FOSDEM at Config Management Camp talking about the relicensing of Terraform. So, you know, our industry is circling back to the same topics. Yeah, happy to answer any questions now or after the talk. Thank you very much, and may the open source be with you.